So the following is a short lecture providing direction on our next assignment or next kind of major written assignment known as a Gobbet. And I will be providing very detailed written directions regarding the Gobbet exercise. But I thought this is something that if we were meeting in person, I would probably devote some class time to explaining in greater depth. So I'll try and say a few things here. So first of all, we might start off by identifying what exactly a Gobbet is, right? So Gobbet is basically, as indicated here in the slide, a short commentary on an assigned primary source, but more often than not is an excerpt from a primary source, right? Where you contextualize it by properly identifying it, putting it within its proper historical context in terms of the broader developments and events surrounding it. And then provide analysis. How do historians actually use this excerpt in order to understand what happened, to arrive at some understanding of cause and effect and so forth? We're going to be doing a Gobbet exercise in connection with a historical event known as the Suez Crisis. And I'm going to provide a short documentary like a short video, just to give you some basic historical context. So I'm not going to get into that too much here, right? But the idea is with the Gobbet, by the way, you're not guessing. The idea is that you have to properly research it. And in this case, you're really kind of looking to see how historians in the past have utilized this particular primary source excerpt, right, to see what the general consensus is, right? Though, even if you were trying to do an original research, that would probably be your starting point, right? We're never reinventing the wheel. We're building on what historians before us have accomplished. So, regarding the Gobbet, right? So the Gobbet is actually highly structured in terms of its form. It can be divided into three different components. The first would be identification. The second would be description, where you're kind of putting it into its proper context, like just literally describing what was going on at the time. Maybe saying something about the author of the primary source, the excerpt. The identification is where you would indicate what kind of document we're looking at, whether it was a speech, a journal, it might be some kind of legal document and so forth. Those two parts, the identification and description, are pretty straightforward, though you still do have to research it, right? Again, you're not guessing. The hard part is the third part, the analysis, where you really try to interpret the particular primary source or excerpt that you're looking at. Though, in order to do that properly, you really do need to get the first two parts done correctly, right? So just to give kind of a brief example here before we look at each component of the Gobbet in greater detail individually, if you were looking, for instance, at the excerpt from the British Prime Minister Chamberlain's speech about peace in our time, right? In order to really properly understand that particular excerpt, you would first need to identify and situate the document, right? Identify, the exact kind of document, that it was a speech being given to the British people before the British Parliament. So it kind of, to some degree, reflected the official policy that Chamberlain was adopting. In this case, this was, 1938, after a meeting with Hitler, regarding developments in Czechoslovakia. And I'm assuming that a lot of you are familiar with the basic contours of the Munich Conference, but the idea that Chamberlain was trying to avoid war, and so had made concessions to Hitler regarding territory he was claiming in Czechoslovakia, right? That all goes into the context or descriptive part of the Gobbet, right? Where you're kind of, you would talk about the Munich Conference, the fact that he's returning from that conference. So just very basic information regarding what was going on surrounding it. And the analysis section is probably where you would have to do a bit more research, to kind of understand attitudes about the possibility of going to war. For instance, to appreciate that, Chamberlain, when he indicated a willingness to make concessions to Hitler to avoid conflict, this was very much in step with the public attitude in Britain at the time. He wasn't like, somehow standing in opposition to how most British people felt. This wasn't too long after the First World War. That you could kind of see where that might go a bit into the context section, but in a way it really is more relevant to the analysis, to kind of understanding why he was saying this, understanding how it was received and so forth. Obviously, in terms of analysis, you might explore further that Britain didn't feel prepared for war. The fact you might think about the consequences of what's indicated by this excerpt, a willingness to appease Hitler. This is something that would actually push the Soviet Union down the line into being more open and willing to accommodate Hitler with respect to Poland, kind of a realization by the Soviet Union that they couldn't count on Britain or France in the event that Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and so forth, right? A lot of that would go into the analysis section, but at this point I'd like to look at each component of the Gobbet in a bit more detail, starting with identification. So identification, if you kind of break it down, really you could just identify a number of very specific kinds of information that you would provide in that part of the Gobbet. And, and by the way, you might structure the Gobbet in a semi-outline form where it's very clear what the, you introduce the identification section by indicating it as such, then the description section and the analysis section and so forth. So identification, what kind of document is it? Where does it come from? Is it a government document? Is it a private journal account? Is it a formal speech? Does it reflect government policy or the opinion of an individual? Who wrote it? Was it the foreign minister? In this case, you kind of need to note, is he actually representing the policy of his government, or is he expressing his own personal view? What was the author's position? Right? So, again, what is his government position, for instance? But you might also talk about social status. Later on when you get to the analysis section, you're considering, does this reflect the views of a particular social group or a particular political party and so forth? What is the excerpt saying in the most literal sense, right? Not where you're interpreting it, but just literally what is it saying? To some degree, you're literally just paraphrasing what is in the excerpt here, though you might note whether there are key phrases that stand out and what are they. Right, so if you were doing the excerpt from Chamberlain's speech, right, probably it would be, a few paragraphs within which would be that particular phrase, peace in our time, and that would obviously be a standout phrase. Again, you don't want to guess here. You will need to do a little bit of research on this. And, again, this isn't about a kind of original research. You're looking to see what the general consensus is among historians. The next section is the description section, which is really another word for it might be where you provide the broader context. With what larger development is it connected? Going back again to Chamberlain's speech, probably the most obvious broader context would be the Munich conference. Right? So, I wouldn't really connect it to World War II. That hasn't happened yet. In the analysis section, you might, of course, discuss how developments during the Munich conference, particularly as reflected in the primary source excerpt that you're looking at, might have constituted a factor leading to the Second World War, but that wouldn't be context. You'd really be talking about kind of the immediate events leading up to that excerpt, maybe a little bit kind of, what happened immediately after. This section would also take into account motivation, but in the most obvious sense, right? Like that Chamberlain is now returning from Munich, and this was a very important international conference that was being covered by all the major press. So he obviously had to make some kind of statement regarding the outcome, both to the Parliament and the public at large. Was it trying to achieve something? Again, in the most obvious sense. What was the most obvious reason for Chamberlain to actually make this speech? And, specifically to say whatever it is that is contained within the excerpt of that primary source, and does it reflect any particular interests. So in this case, the fact that it reflects British foreign policies, it's kind of a statement of the position the British government is adopting with respect to Germany, developments in Czechoslovakia, and so forth. In other cases, it might reflect different kinds of interests. They might correspond to a particular social group. But again, we're looking at kind of what's on the surface here, what's very obvious, right? Not where you're kind of looking below the surface and something might portend to be reflective of the interests of the public at large, but when you examine it more closely, it really reflects the interests of, say, political elites and so forth, right? That would be more in the analysis section. And of course, in some ways, the analysis section is the most important one and the most difficult, right? So this is where you're actually now interpreting the excerpt. But again, in this case, you're researching to see how historians have until now interpreted this particular excerpt. What is kind of the general consensus? You're more than welcome to introduce some kind of controversial points of view, but as long as you first indicate what the kind of majority view is among historians, right? So what are some things you're looking for? What does it tell us about attitudes, or shall I say the mentalité of that time? I already mentioned how with Chamberlain's speech, this quote, "peace in our time," that really would have reflected the general sentiment of the British public, right? So, that's kind of important to know. It's not just, Chamberlain's point of view, his own personal opinion, and that somehow it's an outlier, right? That it doesn't correspond to how the majority of the British public viewed the situation at the time. Does it help explain later developments, cause and effect? Well, for instance, a kind of in-depth analysis would show that this had a major impact on Soviet policy with respect to Germany moving forward. This certainly seemed to send a signal to Hitler that he pretty much could do what he wanted, particularly in contravention of what had been agreed with the Treaty of Versailles, concluding the First World War, that was supposed to set very strict limits on what Germany could do militarily. Hitler was quite convinced based on the outcome of the Munich conference and Chamberlain's adoption of a policy of what we call appeasement, where he was making concessions to Hitler that he could do what he wanted and there would be little to any consequences. So all of that would be cause and effect. This is also where you explore in greater depth the language of the document, certain key phrases, etc. You might consider, for instance, whether the terminology reflected a kind of political discourse at the time, which might not be evident until you research it. Again, this is where you really have to be careful not to guess. To give an example, there's a very, very famous Supreme Court ruling regarding the segregation of schools, where the Supreme Court ruled that schools should segregate with deliberate speed. Very often on the face of it, it would seem that the Supreme Court was, actually saying that this should happen very rapidly. But if you research it more carefully, if you consider the way in which legal language is very often applied, it really was kind of leaving it for the states to decide how fast they wanted to move in that regard, right? So that wouldn't be obvious just looking at the language in a superficial way. You have to research it. Along with the short lecture that I'm providing here and the detailed directions and also the video providing some basic historical context regarding the Suez Crisis, I'm also providing 3 sample Gobbets, one of which I'm going to go over right now, and it's presented in outline form, like a real outline, which is not how you should do the Gobbet. For the most part, it's in written form, though you can break it down into 3 proper sections that are identified as such. So the first that we're going to look at here and present in outline form is something called the Balfour Declaration, which corresponds to developments relevant to the Middle East during World War I. Had to do with British policy regarding the settlement of Palestine by Zionist Jews. So I'm connected with the Zionist movement, kind of a Jewish nationalist movement aimed at creating a Jewish state in more or less what corresponded to that at that time to Palestine. The other two, the first of the other two will be from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from the French Revolution. And finally, there is a kind of sample Gobbet written by a previous student of mine on the aforementioned Chamberlain speech connected with the phrase peace in our time. So those two are kind of more, for you to look over on your own. But right now I'm going to go over what would be the elements for a Gobbet on the Balfour Declaration, right? So, again, you wouldn't write your own Gobbet in outline form, but I'm presenting it as such to make it more clear what are the elements that one might include. So with the identification section, first of all, it is, and what is it? What kind of document is it? It is a precise expression of British foreign policy. This is not simply the opinion of any one individual. This is actually a statement of formal British foreign policy. It is widely published. It is not some kind of secret agreement. So everyone would have been aware of it. And, given the time period, that's actually important because you had many secret agreements that were also formal statements of policy, but were not widely known. The author was the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour. And so, this kind of ties in with the fact that it is a formal statement of British foreign policy. And that's important to know. He's not just giving his own personal opinion. It is actually in the form of a letter addressed to Lord Rothschild, the president of the British Zionist Foundation, who in this capacity was representing the movement of Zionism as a whole. It is a formal statement of British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The more precise term is Jewish national home, right? So remember, in the identification section, you want to present this kind of information in a very literal sense. It does not say a Jewish state in Palestine, and you shouldn't say it either. Certainly not in the identification section. And you might note that the Balfour Declaration makes reference to the non-Jewish inhabitants guaranteeing their civil and religious liberties. In some ways, my decision to include that in the identification section is based on the fact that when I get to the analysis section, I'm going to examine the fact that it doesn't say anything about the political rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine, right? So, by the way, as you're researching your Gobbet, as you're kind of putting it together, you might end up going back, say, to the identification section and adding something because you become aware that it's, like a particular phrase is very relevant. So those are the main elements I would put into the identification section of a Gobbet on the Balfour Declaration. I should have also put that it was issued in December of 1917, though that would be in the actual excerpt. And usually I recommend that the student include the actual primary source excerpt at the very top, right? Just so, whoever is reading it, in this case me, can actually reference the excerpt itself while I'm reading what you wrote about it. The next section, the description section, this is where you have to provide context. Helpful would be understanding a little bit about Zionism, a movement that had developed during the late 19th century, which essentially was a movement of Jewish nationalism, right? Kind of promoting the idea that the Jews are a national people and that they deserve to have their own state. And at a pretty early point, they decided that said Jewish state should be in Palestine based on the Jewish biblical history connected with that particular territory. Other things I might include that British support of Zionism, as evident by the Balfour Declaration, reflected, from their point of view, a part of the war effort, right? This was during the First World War. They were at war with not just Germany and Austria-Hungary, but also the Ottoman Empire, of which Palestine was a part. But it wasn't just that. Probably most relevant is that Russia had at this point left the war, and the United States had yet to enter it. And there was a perception that Jews were financially powerful worldwide. This was a myth, but it was one that many people believed. And that by supporting Zionism, this would win the favor of powerful Jews in both the United States, where there were large numbers of Jews living, but also in Russia, right? And that in both cases, influential Jews would persuade their governments, in the case of Russia, to re-enter the war, in the case of the United States, to enter it for the first time. So it's kind of relevant also that Balfour was the head of the U.S. war mission. Finally, in the context section, right, so we've contextualized it with respect to Zionism. We contextualized it with respect to the First World War, kind of what was going on at the time. Finally, I might note that from the point of view of the Zionist movement, which was headed up by the World Zionist Organization, right, of which the British Federation was a component, having the support of a great power lent it a tremendous amount of legitimacy, right? So, I mean, for a while, the leaders of the Zionist movement had been trying to gain the support of one or another major power in Europe. In fact, as noted here in the slide, one concern was that from the British point of view is that if they didn't move fast enough, Germany would actually step up and demonstrate support for Zionism, right? So there's kind of the idea of heading off a German bid at Zionist support. So that would be the description or context section. Again, you have to research it. I'm pretty sure most of this you wouldn't be able to guess. And then finally, we come to the analysis section, right? And this is in some ways the most interesting part. So relevant here might be the contradictory nature of British policy during the First World War. This is where you might make reference to the fact that alongside the Balfour Declaration, right, the kind of indication of British support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, the British had also made agreements with the Arabs in support of their independence if they rose up and rebelled against the Ottoman Empire, to support an independent Arab state that, from the point of view of many Arabs, was intended to include Palestine, and that they had also made an agreement, a secret agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, with the French about how to divide up the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire on the assumption that the Ottoman Empire wouldn't survive the First World War. And in that particular agreement, most of what constitutes Palestine had been designated as an international zone because of the religious importance of Jerusalem and some of the surrounding environs with respect to many of the world's great religions. So, kind of making promises to a lot of different parties that to some degree were not compatible. This is where you might discuss the role of the Balfour Declaration in kind of laying the foundation for the future Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is where you might, kind of ask, well, are there other, what were the motives behind the British support for Zionism? We already talked about what was kind of, public knowledge about British support. The fact that, there was a perception that Jews were very influential, and this might help get the United States and Russia into the war. But there are some, when we explore more deeply, we find other possible incentives, right? That the British were in control of the Suez Canal. So having some measure of control over Palestine, and there's kind of the perception that if the British were going to support the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine, which would basically mean, supporting large-scale Jewish immigration to Palestine, there would need to be a British military presence to ensure their security, right? So this would, allow the British to maintain control of Palestine, would provide a buffer for protecting the Suez Canal, would also provide a land link between Egypt and Mesopotamia, what today is Iraq, which would also end up under British control, all of which kind of tied into the importance of India, right? So this could be part of a trade route to India, India being the crown jewel of the British Empire. Some other things you might put into your analysis section, right? Well, I already mentioned Palestine was supposed to be an international zone, so the Balfour Declaration provided a kind of pretext for British military control of Palestine, which, by the way, by the conclusion of the First World War, the British military had in fact militarily occupied Palestine, so kind of justifying why they would remain there, right? Given that militarily they were already in the process of taking control of Palestine. So Balfour Declaration, right, becomes later on a basis for Britain being awarded control of Palestine after the First World War. Right, they develop what's known as the mandatory system, where the various Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire came under European control. The idea was that, and it's primarily the British and French, that they were supposed to prepare these territories, the people living in them, for eventual independence. So Britain would end up being awarded the Mandate of Palestine, in large measure because of the Balfour Declaration. In fact, the terms of the Balfour Declaration will be incorporated into the Mandate for Palestine, which will be overseen by the League of Nations. Some other things you might discuss. This will really create many complications for Britain with respect to the other Arab countries. I mean, many of them are going to take issue with British support of Zionism, which is seen as running contrary to the interests of the native Arab inhabitants of Palestine. And finally, and this is, I already referenced, right? This is where one really important phrase within the Balfour Declaration is the reference to the protection of the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. And so it is not accidental or inconsequential that no mention is made of political rights. Right. By the way, when we're talking about legal binding documents of this kind, in this case reflective of government policy, the wording is thought about very carefully. So consider the fact, no mention made of the political rights of the indigenous population, and consider that the indigenous population are referred to as the non-Jewish inhabitants. That is very important. There is no recognition that they actually constitute a national people of their own, right? The Palestinian Arabs, or even simply as Arabs. So kind of a way of diminishing the idea that they had, even further, that they had any kind of political rights in the sense of, shall we say, and this was kind of the prevailing, kind of the buzzword at the Paris Peace Conference after the First World War, the idea that all the peoples on the planet had the right to national self-determination, right? So this is kind of a way of denying them access to that principle, which was being floated quite heavily during the Paris Peace Conference. In any event, right? So that's just to give you an idea of, some of what you might put into a Gobbet on the Balfour Declaration. Of course, there is some scope for variation. Obviously, there are some things that really have to be there. Other things, kind of reflect an effort to go into, maybe the, shall we say, minutia of the wording, or, kind of the impact of a particular document, kind of 3 degrees down the line kind of thing. But hopefully you have a basic idea of what constitutes a Gobbet. Again, we have the other 2 examples, the one corresponding to the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and also an actual written Gobbet on the Peace in Our Time speech by Chamberlain, which was written by a former student of mine, but it was an extremely well done one, right? So hopefully between this discussion and the other examples I'm providing, you have a pretty clear idea of what you need to do with the excerpt from the Suez Crisis that you will be doing your Gobbet on.